Let's look at the middleware that is installed in the current application. Inside of the configure method, if we're in a development environment, the first piece of middleware that is installed in the pipeline is a piece of middleware known as the developer exception page middleware. Anytime you add middleware to the front of the pipeline, you're doing that for one of two reasons. Either you want the middleware at the front of the pipeline so it's the first to receive an incoming request, or you want this middleware at the beginning of the pipeline so it's the last piece of middleware that will execute once the response is flowing out of the server and back from the middleware. Remember, the middleware pipeline, just like the corn processing pipeline, it's a bidirectional pipeline. Requests come in, responses go out. The developer exception page middleware is first because it really cares about what's going to happen in the outgoing response. It doesn't care anything about an incoming request. All the developer exception page wants to do is call to the next piece of middleware, whatever that may be, allow the request to flow through, and then to see if any other piece of middleware later in the pipeline throws an exception. If so, this exception page middleware wants to handle that exception and display a page that will help developers to debug this problem. So we only install the developer exception page when we're in development because the developer exception page middleware will catch an unhandled exception and render HTML about that exception. So things like a stack trace and in what file and on what line of code did this exception occur. That's too much information to use in production, so if there is an exception when we're running in production or when we're not in development, we're going to use a different piece of middleware, the exception handler middleware, which is also listening for an exception to come out of the rest of the middleware. But now instead of showing detailed information about the exception, use exception handler allows you to render some other page or view in your application that can show the user a friendly or error message, and an error message that won't include sensitive information like file names and line numbers. Another piece of middleware that we install, and only in production because of caching issues, is the Hsts middleware. Hsts middleware essentially instructs the browser to only access this information over a secure connection. If for some reason you don't want to use a secure HTTPS connection, perhaps because you have a proxy sitting in front that takes care of the encryption for you, then you can remove the Hsts middleware as well as the HTTPS redirection middleware. This is going to send an HTTP redirect instruction to any browser that tries to access the application using plain HTTP. Then we have the static files middleware and the node modules middleware. We already know that static files attempts to serve a request by responding with a file that's in the www root folder, and the node modules middleware was a piece of middleware that we installed to serve static files from the node_modules folder. Almost all middleware is going to take some options of one kind or another if you want to customize the middleware. For example, use static files will take an object that is of type static file options. So if we just take a quick look at static file options, some of the parameters behavior that I can set would be to specify things like the default content type, and I can even specify a file provider. Notice this is of type iFileProvider. So we're passing in an abstraction, and we can implement that interface to look for static files anywhere. If we wanted to look in the database for a particular file, or go to some storage in the cloud like Azure Blob Storage, we can specify a file provider to have static files work in whatever manner we need. The next piece of middleware here would be to use cookie policy. This is a piece of middleware that's going to help track if the user has consented to the use of cookies. So you might have noticed the first time you ran the Ode to Food application, there's a message that appears that you can customize to specify your cookie policy. Once the user accepts your cookie policy, there's going to be a cookie set for this application, the ASP.NET.consent cookie, that will let you know if the user ever returns here that the user has already consented. So this works with some other services inside of ASP.NET Core that you can check with to make sure the user has consented to the use of cookies and tracking. And finally, the last piece of middleware is use Mvc Middleware. This is like the router middleware that we talked about earlier. This is the piece of middleware where if nothing else has served a file or done any useful work and started to return, use Mvc Middleware is going to look at the incoming request and then try to route that request to render a razor page or to invoke a controller that will render a razor view. So remember, each piece of middleware in this pipeline has the ability to stop processing and not call into the next piece of middleware in the pipeline. For example, If use static files sees there's a request for /image.jpg and that request matches a file image.jpg in the www root folder, then the static files middleware can just render that image and return that image back to the client, and we never have to call into the next piece of middleware in the pipeline. So in that case, we would never get to the MVC middleware, which would try to route the image.jpg request to a controller or a Razor page. And that's why the order of this middleware is important. Likewise, you could also have a piece of middleware here, let's say, that is checking for some sort of cookie or authorization token, and if it doesn't find that token, throws an exception. In that case, you can be sure there's no other middleware later in the pipeline that will execute. Now, some of the other pieces of middleware that you might use and commonly see when you're programming with ASP.NET Core include app.useAuthentication. So this piece of middleware is going to attempt to establish the identity of a user. And so you typically see this piece of middleware later in the pipeline so that anything that comes afterwards has a chance to know who the user is. Anything that comes before app.useAuthentication might not be able to establish the identity of a user. There's also app.use Signalr. So if you want to use Signalr to do real-time WebSocket communication, there's a piece of middleware here to handle those types of connections and requests. And there's also, for someone who's using a SPA framework, which is a piece of middleware that essentially allows you to say, if no one else has responded and done anything in this middleware pipeline, then let me use this piece of middleware and a little bit of configuration to tell you what to do. This is typically where you want to render your index.html page, so the primary opening page that is the single page in your single page application. And you can see just in the IntelliSense, there's various other pieces of middleware that you might come across. So use CORS, which allows you to specify cross-origin resource sharing headers to the browser. And some of the things I'm talking about now are obviously covered in other Pluralsight courses, so using Signalr and building SPAs with ASP.NET Core. What I want to do next is just give you a little demonstration of what it might look like to write your own piece of middleware.